semester, we have to do a service learning project. So our goal is to get in the deaf community, find a problem, and figure out a way to address it. So my team and I found out that a lot of people don't know how to deal with deaf people in their careers just because they don't have any exposure to it previously, and it's an unknown to them. So my goal today is just to give you a little bit of exposure, give you some tips and some resources, so that in the future, if you run into deaf people in your career, you'll have a better idea of what to do and how to effectively handle the situation. So first of all, in this picture, you can't look at someone and see who's deaf and who's not. And it's the same in real life. You can't just be walking down the street and automatically pinpoint someone as deaf. You may see some cues if they have a hearing aid, a cochlear implant, if they are using sign language, but those aren't dead giveaways. I use sign language. I'm a hearing person. Some people use hearing aids just to help them with environmental noise. They still can't understand speech with that. So you really have to take time and analyze the situation. You can't make snap judgments when you're working with deaf people and identifying who's deaf and who's not. So what are some careers that you guys are looking at with the criminal justice field?
Law enforcement.
Law enforcement? Pretty much the same? Okay. So law enforcement, you're probably going to run into some deaf people in your career. So what's at risk if you can't communicate with them? Possibly their life, their liberty, if they're the suspect, your case, if you're interviewing them or interrogating them. So if you can't communicate with these people, there is a lot at risk. And that's why I want to help you know how to effectively communicate with them. Just some stories to really prove my point here that effective communication is still a challenge, even with ADA in place. This first story, jury duty, happened in Alabama last summer. One of my friends was called for jury duty. She was going to be out of town on business, so she called to see if she could get it postponed. At the end of the conversation, she said, by the way, I'll need an interpreter because I'm deaf. She was calling through a video phone using a video interpreter, and she said, I'll need an interpreter that day because I'm deaf, and they tried to just waive her. Most people would be overjoyed that they got out of jury duty, but it really bothered my friend. She wanted to be able to serve in that way. And what bothered her even more was that the courts were just trying to waive her because they didn't want to go through the trouble of finding and paying for an interpreter. She went through the Alabama Order of Courts and Department of Justice before this was finally resolved, and she ended up getting her chance to serve. But it was very frustrating because the very system that's supposed to uphold the law was trying to deny her accommodations. So that's just a reminder that you have to constantly be aware of what's required of you when dealing with someone who needs accommodations. There was a deaf man. This actually happened before ADA, and stories like this are a major reason that we have ADA now. There was a deaf man. His house was searched twice. He was arrested, appeared in court several times, written requests for an interpreter 4 times. He was only given an interpreter 1 day in this whole process. So he really did not know what was truly going on, which leads to the third point. Many are convicted without knowing what they're convicted of or without a full understanding. There was a staff interpreter working at a correctional facility. Within his career, he estimated that he worked with about 85 deaf inmates. And he said that of those 85, only half of them knew what they were convicted of when they arrived at the correctional facility. They didn't have a full understanding. They didn't understand what they were being convicted of, why, because they hadn't had access to effective communication. Many times people go at this with a one-size-fits-all mentality, and that's not true because deaf people have had so many different experiences growing up. 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents who can't communicate with them at first. Because of that, their language is delayed. They have different experiences growing up orally with English as their first language, growing up with home signs, which is not a recognized language, growing up with American Sign Language. They have varied experiences, so you have to be creative in your approach to be able to match their specific needs to make sure communication happens for that individual. And lastly, there have been many cases of deaf individuals being beaten, being arrested because they failed to follow verbal commands. They can't follow what they can't hear. So if you are a beat cop someday and this person's not following your command to stop, they may be ignoring you, but they may be deaf. So it just takes a little bit more time and effort on your part to really stop and analyze the situation and see what may be going on. This also relates to trying to arrest a deaf person. If the deaf person is being arrested and they don't understand why, or they're trying to defend themselves, they may be trying to speak in their first language, which may be sign language, which oftentimes is viewed as resisting arrest because they're talking with their hands, you can't put the cuffs on them. And so many times when a deaf person is arrested, they're also charged with resisting arrest when that may not be the case. Applicable laws. You guys, criminal justice majors, minors, y'all know what's required of you. My encouragement to you is not forget it. When you get out and you're working every day, you're probably not going to see a deaf person that often. I hope not. But you will every now and then, and you can't forget what's required of you and the accommodations that these people are provided under ADA and the Rehabilitation Act. Now, when you first are working with a deaf person, you're not going to have an interpreter. Hopefully, later on down the road, if this is a complex situation, you're going to be able to get an interpreter. But when you're first interacting with them, deaf people don't come with interpreters. So you're going to have to figure out how to communicate with them. First of all, getting the person's attention can be a little bit tricky. The deaf community and law enforcement are typically at odds because deaf community is very touch-oriented. Law enforcement has personal space for safety reasons. So those two are always at odds. Deaf people like to get attention by touching on the shoulder, things like that, which can be perceived as threats. So keep that in mind. It may not be a threat. They may just be trying to get your attention and not know that that's not acceptable with law enforcement. When you're trying to get their attention, like I said, hollering after them is not going to work. Your best option is to get within their line of sight. Always face the person. Reading lips is very difficult. It's even more difficult if they can't see your face. But even if they don't lip read, they may be able to pick up on some cues from your gestures, from your mannerisms, and facial expressions. Always try to converse in a well-lit area so that they can see clearly. Deaf people rely on visual information, and they can't get that visual information if they can't see you. So if you pull over someone at night and realize they're deaf, it's obviously not going to be the most well-lit environment. Use street lights, use flashlights, whatever you can to make sure that they can see you. So really, my theme for today is you're going to have to be creative. Never cover your mouth when you talk because that muffles the sound. So if they are picking up any auditory information, that's going to lessen their ability to do that. And it also covers up what you're saying. So if they are getting any cues from lip reading, you're going to take that away as well. Never assume that the individual can hear you. Like we said, walking down the street and you're telling someone to stop and they're not, they may not be able to hear you. Also, if you see someone wearing a hearing aid, don't assume that they can understand speech. A lot of deaf people use hearing aids for background, environmental noises, doorbells, sirens, that type of thing. Minimize background noise whenever possible when you're speaking to someone. I realize that when you're out and about and doing things, it's not going to be possible, but always try your hardest to minimize distractions and background noise because that's going to interfere with their ability to pick up any auditory cues or anything like that. Speak slowly and distinctly. This doesn't mean that you have to take on that really slow, exaggerated speech. That's not going to help. But just remember to keep a calm pace. If you usually speak pretty evenly, you can say you're normal. If you typically speak faster, like you've had 10 cups of coffee, then you might need to slow it down a little bit. Always use visual aids whenever possible, whether that be drawing something, pointing to things, pulling out your phone and using Google Images, whatever it is, use the visual because deaf people rely on visual information. So if you can't communicate with them in sign language, use other visual information to get the point across. And remember that lip reading is not a viable source of communication often. Only about 1/3 of spoken language is visible on your lips, so it can become very confusing and very muddled, especially if the deaf person's not already familiar with the terminology that you're using. Some people are trained very well in this. They grow up doing this and they do it every day, so they're going to be able to do that. If that's that person's preferred mode of communication, go for it. But understand that not all deaf people can lip read. And keep in mind that they have a lot of varied experiences. Like I said, many times they're born to hearing parents, and because of that, their language can be delayed, meaning that they may not have a good grasp of written English. So if you have to write notes back and forth, keep it simple. Use simple words, don't use terminology or complex sentences.
So when I was really young, probably kindergarten or first grade, I have a much older brother, and we'd go out to recess, and there was this older guy, he might have been in like 5th or 6th grade, that always used to be on.
Today we went to a high school and
I was posing for a picture with all of my girlfriends when all of a sudden one of them leaped forward.
Can you read my lips?
Can you read my lips?
Can you read?
Can you read my lips? Can you read her lips?
My Clementine loves French. She stole it off the
Can you read his lips?
I have 2 dogs, 1 boxer.
I'm dead. That's a word. Is a hairy one. I rely on the visual, not the auditory. The word lip reading implies reading, then reading a book.
Whose text is legible and clear.
But the human face isn't a book, and lip reading isn't reading. People mumble, people talk fast enough loudly, people have facial hair like porcupines, lips like sphincters, people cover their mouths, people have accents. But real conversations don't take place in a studio.
Roll it out, lady.
I'm putting together a puzzle without all the pieces. I look in a new month and try to grasp with one sense information intended for another. There have been times when I questioned why I even tried to breathe through this storm, when I could just use sign language. Some deaf people choose to do just that. It's like a different world, a world filled with rich expression and culture. When people sound, they come alive, but I know I want both worlds. Communication is never a given.
Tuesday, I woke up, had a rash.
She just pulled my dress down.
When I was little, my family got a cat.
Like Wednesday, hit him in the face. That was like the last thing that I ever.
guinea pig.
Which I learned how to ski. I only cried twice.
But when the reading works, what I focus on one natural face and launch into a conversation, something clicks. Right then, I feel something extraordinary.
There was no outside
Human
Connection.
So that was just to drive home a point that lip reading is not always a viable form of communication. If that's all the deaf person is getting, that's not effective and that's not going to work. You're going to have to try other resources. Now, if you can work with an interpreter, first of all, when, like I said, deaf people don't come with interpreters, so you're going to have a period before the interpreter arrives that you have to make work. I mean, and if you're at the police station and you need to interview someone, you can just let them sit and wait until the deaf person arrives. But if you're called out and there's an emergency situation, you're gonna have to go on and, you know, remove the threat, whatever the situation calls for, before the interpreter gets there. So, first of all, you're gonna have to use all of those other tips from before. Gesturing, drawing, writing notes, whatever you can to figure out what kind of communication they need, what works for that person. If there's any complex conversation with someone who doesn't speak the same language as you, you're going to need to hire an interpreter, because the more sticky it gets, you're going to need to be comfortable in your first language, they're going to need to be comfortable in their first language, and that's going to require an interpreter. When you're using an interpreter, always remember to look at the deaf person, understanding that they're not going to be looking at you. They're going to be looking at the interpreter, so it's going to feel very awkward for you to look at the deaf person, but it's a sign of respect. It's kind of how to use an interpreter 101. And also, if the person you're working, the deaf person is a victim, not looking at them could only intensify emotions that they're already feeling and really escalate the situation. Talk at your normal rate. You don't have to slow it down too much, but please don't talk too quickly, because that just confuses the whole situation. Also, only one person should speak at a time. If you're overlapping, that just becomes confused. The deaf person's going to become confused as to who is speaking at what time. So just remember to take it slow to make sure that everything is as clear as possible. Use short sentences and simple words. This isn't because deaf people are stupid or because interpreters can't handle it, but many times the hearing population is very used to criminal justice terminology because they watch the news, they watch crime shows, and deaf people may not always have that same access to information, so they may not be as familiar with the same terminology that you think is common. So what happens is the interpreter is going to have to break that down to make it understandable, and so it's much better if you, who are the professional in that setting, can break it down first, and it becomes much clearer. And never use family members, children, friends, anyone as interpreters. Most of the time, they're not qualified to interpret. Even if they are, you have a deaf man who is married to the best interpreter in the state, they're still not neutral, so they're not effective for that situation. Also, a good rule of thumb is if you are interviewing or interrogating someone using an interpreter, video and audio record the session. So later, if problems come up, if the deaf person says, I didn't say that, or they didn't ask me that, or whatever, you can have that video analyzed. And hopefully you're not going to lose your information, your case won't get thrown out, whatever the situation is, because you have proof of what was actually said. So first of all, really just be familiar with the laws, be familiar with what's required of you, what you need to do. I have a handout here that has a website at the bottom that my team and I created, and it has a lot of really good resources, and one of my favorites is a handout that was created by the Department of Justice. Thank you. And it outlines what is truly required of you based on ADA and like situations, a routine traffic stop. You pull someone over, walk up to the window, realize they're deaf. Immediately, do you have to call an interpreter? No. You're going to be there for 5-10 minutes tops under routine traffic stop. So if you can use those other tips to make it work, make yourself understood, that's fine. If something escalates from there, you see something suspicious, you need to search their car, whatever, or if they're not understanding you, then you have to go through measures for another option, hire an interpreter, something like that. But the handout that's on the website really delves into different explanations of what you do in specific situations. There's also like a 30-minute training video that provides really clear examples of real-life situations, things that often happen and how they should be handled. So that's also a really cool resource that's on that website for you. And always hire a certified neutral interpreter, because you want to make sure that they're qualified for the job. Criminal justice situations are often emotional, often very sensitive, so you want to make sure that you have someone qualified and a professional to handle that. Alabama has a list of people who are qualified to interpret in those types of settings. The website has 3 different registries on it. Has a national registry, So if you work outside the state of Alabama, that's a resource for you. It has an Alabama registry, and it has the court-approved registry for the state of Alabama. They hold a special certification, a specialist, and there's only 2 or 3 of them in the state of Alabama, so they're hard to come by. But the court-approved list has those at the top, and then under that is the next best. If you can't find these are the ones you go to. So that's also a really good resource for you. Never leave an interpreter alone with the deaf person. It can screw up your neutrality and you no longer have a neutral interpreter. Oftentimes, deaf people are so overjoyed, especially in a traumatic or an emotional setting, to see someone who speaks their language that they will tell us things. You don't want to be put in a position where your interpreter knows more about the situation than you do. So if you leave the room, the interpreter leaves the room. Even if they just wait in the hallway, it's also a safety issue for the interpreter. You don't want to leave them alone with someone who could be a suspect or something like that. A CDI, a Certified Deaf Interpreter, may be necessary. And I know that deaf interpreter seems a little contradictory. I am a hearing interpreter who works with deaf people. I'm a hearing person who interprets. A deaf interpreter is a deaf person who interprets, which seems very contradictory. But as a deaf person, they've grown up, this is their first language. They know intricacies of the language that I will never know as a second language learner, as an adult language learner. They also have been specially trained in like gestural communication. So if the person is very emotional and they can't express themselves clearly, a certified deaf interpreter will be able to help with that. If they have low language for some reason, a deaf interpreter will be able to help with that. If they've moved in from somewhere else and they have a foreign sign language, just anything like that. If it's a very complex situation, a deaf interpreter might need to be brought in. A deaf interpreter doesn't work alone. They'll be brought in to work in tandem with a hearing interpreter. So they always work as a team. So it does take a little bit longer. It does have a long process, but it's worth it to get the information that you need in those situations. Does anybody have any questions for me? Okay. Well, I really appreciate y'all's time and paying attention to me. I really believe that someday you are going to work with a deaf person in your career, and so I want you to be able to approach that the best that you can, both for you and for the deaf person, because a lot of times deaf people are denied accommodations, and that's really, really sad. Troy does have the interpreter training program, which I'm not suggesting you change majors, but we also have a minor, and even if you don't do the full minor, you can take a couple of ASL classes as electives. That's not going to make you able to interpret for a deaf suspect or witness or whatever, but it'll help you in that in-between time, being able to communicate with them before the interpreter arrives. So I really suggest that, and if you want more information about that, I can give it to you. But thanks for listening to me.